Al Capone. The kingpin of Chicago gangsters Alphonse Gabriel Capone, better known as Al Capone, has become one of the most famous figures in American history, symbolizing both the rise and fall of organized crime. In this video, we follow his life. From his childhood to his downfall. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born on January 17, 1899, in Brooklyn, New York, to a poor Italian family. His parents, Gabriel and Teresa Capone, emigrated from the Italian city of Angri, in the province of Salerno, in search of a better life. Gabriel was a barber, and Teresa was a housewife. Capone had 8 siblings, making life in a small apartment even more difficult. Capone grew up in a neighborhood that was home to Italian immigrants. It was a time when American society was suspicious of people from Europe, especially Italians, who were often associated with crime. In such conditions, young Alphonse had to learn to survive from an early age. The Capone family wanted their children to get an education and find good jobs. Al Capone went to a Catholic school, where the teachers were strict and students from poor families were discriminated against. Alphonse had problems with discipline already in the 6th grade. At the age of 14, he hit a teacher after the teacher publicly humiliated him. This incident marked the end of his schooling. After Capone dropped out of school, he began working to help support the family. He changed many small jobs. He worked in a drugstore, a grocery store clerk, and even as a shoe shiner. One of his first serious jobs was working in a bowling alley, where Al Capone followed the life of a street gang. Capone quickly realized that honest work would not allow him to achieve the wealth that the boss talked about. At the time, Brooklyn was home to the 5 Points crime syndicate, which specialized in racketeering, gambling, and smuggling. Like many kids in the area, Al Capone was exposed to the brutal reality of street life from an early age. Brooklyn was home to street gangs that were involved in robberies, racketeering, smuggling, and other criminal activities. These gangs often exploited young people to do their dirty work, and many kids who grew up in these areas were drawn into the criminal world early on. Capone, being bold and ambitious, quickly realized that street life could be a way for him to gain power and wealth. At a young age, he began associating with gangsters, which gave him the opportunity to gain the skills needed for a criminal career. For many Italian immigrants, including the Capone family, America was a country where they could make a living, but also a country where their ethnicity was a constant necessity. The boy Alphonse, like his parents and many other immigrants, saw the difficulties associated with economic hardship and social isolation, which formed in him a special sense of discontent and a desire to change his fate. Little Capone grew up in a world where the forces of law and order, local politics, and foreign policy officials were often not on the side of the poor, and all that was left for the residents of Brooklyn was to rely on their own strength and internal connections. Criminal groups used the poverty and vulnerability of immigrants to make money at the lowest levels of society, and Capone was no exception. For Capone, his close friends and neighborly relationships played a huge role. Most of them were also members of Italian immigrant families. Capone associated with people from childhood, who later became his associates in the criminal world. It was a world of street fraternal solidarity, where family values and mutual support played a huge role. He was part of a world where people relied heavily on each other to survive in a brutal world. His mentor Johnny Torrio played a significant role in his upbringing, introducing him to the criminal world of Chicago, which later became a key moment in his career. After several years of living in Brooklyn, where he worked in different worlds, from selling newspapers to working as a bouncer in clubs, Al Capone realized that in order to achieve wealth and power, he needed to move on. Despite his involvement in street gangs, he saw no progress in the small scale of the New York criminal world. His dreams were much more ambitious, and it was in Chicago that he would take the first step towards greatness in the criminal world. During this period, Capone acquired his famous scar, which later became his calling card. While working as a bouncer in a nightclub, he made an offensive comment about a girl from one of the guests. Her brother, Frank Luke Gulsai, attacked Capone with a knife, leaving deep wounds on the left side of his face. After this, Capone got the nickname Scarface. Scarface, he hated. For friends and family, he was always just Al. In 1918, before moving to Chicago, Capone married May Coughlin, an Irish girl from a working-class family. At the time of their wedding, May had already given birth to her son, Albert Francis Capone, who went by the name Sonny. Despite his criminal background, Capone was known as a caring father and devoted husband. These early years laid the foundation for Al Capone to become one of the most notorious gangsters in history. From a poor boy from Brooklyn to the criminal underworld of Chicago, his path was full of risks and bold steps. After several years of living in Brooklyn, where he worked in different worlds, from selling newspapers to working as a bouncer in clubs, Al Capone realized that in order to achieve wealth and power, he needed to move on. Despite his involvement in street gangs, he saw no progress in the small-scale criminal world of New York. His dreams were much more ambitious, and it was in Chicago that he would take his first step towards greatness in the criminal world. Chicago in the 1920s was one of the largest and most heavily guarded cities in the United States. It was a center of industry, trade, and finance, but also a center of organized crime, especially with the introduction of Prohibition in 1920. The prohibition of alcohol in the country opened up opportunities for large crime syndicates, which began to engage in its smuggling, as well as to develop illegal bars and clubs, the so-called speakeasies. This period became a time of crime. The increase in huge profits from bootlegging and the sale of alcohol led to the fact that gangs and gangsters quickly consolidated their power in cities, and Chicago was no exception. It was here that Capone arrived in 1920, which turned out to be a fateful decision for his career. Meeting Johnny Torrio. When Capone arrived in Chicago, he already had experience working with criminal groups in New York, but Chicago was a completely different world. There were more serious players operating here. It was here that he met Johnny Torrio, one of the most powerful bosses in the city, who at that time controlled part of the city, engaged in racketeering, gambling, and, of course, selling illegal alcohol. Torrio, himself an Italian immigrant, immediately noticed the ambitious and attentive Capone. He became his mentor and associate, teaching him how to run a criminal empire. Torrio was an experienced and cautious player, and he wanted to use Capone's abilities to expand his business and protect his interests in Chicago. In Chicago, Capone quickly gained weight and proved his worth as an organizer. He not only actively used bootlegging, but also control over the city's previously independent gangs, and made deals with other mafia groups. Soon Capone became not only Torrio's right-hand man, but also an influential player in the city's criminal scene. During this period, Capone also became familiar with the basics of the city's criminal figures and established connections with politicians, police officers, and criminal authorities. He began to use tough methods to fight competitors, using bribery and threats to strengthen his power and monopoly on the liquor market. In 1925, when Johnny Torrio suffered a serious attempt on his life, Al Capone took over the management of the criminal empire. After Torrio survived several attempts, he decided to retire and return to Italy, handing over control of his affairs to Capone. The attempt on Torrio's life was part of a bloody power struggle in Chicago, which involved party gangs competing for profits from honest liquor. However, Al Capone was determined, and it was at this point that he finally took control of the city and became the most powerful gangster in Chicago. From the moment Capone took over the business in Chicago, his activities only grew. He established bootlegging of alcohol throughout the country, earning millions of dollars. His network of speakeasies and underground bars flourished. Capone also expanded his influence into other criminal areas, such as prostitution, gambling, racketeering, and contract killings. Under his leadership, Chicago became the epicenter of crime in America, and Capone gained fame as the most brutal and cunning mafioso of his time. Al Capone's move to Chicago was a decisive moment in his career. Here he met people who would become his associates, learned to run a criminal empire, and, finally, became the master of the city. Chicago gave him the opportunity to rise to the top, but at the same time it turned out to be his prison, in which his name will forever be associated with bloody clouds and brutal methods for achieving power. Chicago in the 1920s was full of other gangs. Capone's best enemy was the North Side Gang, led by George "Bugs" Moran. Bloody power struggle. Murder became part of everyday life. Al Capone organized many attacks on the alternative to strengthen his influence. St. Valentine's Day Massacre. In 1929, Capone carried out one of the most notorious crimes in American history, the mass murder of 7 members of the North Side Gang. Although he could not prove the charges, the event became a symbol of his brutality double reputation. To the public, Capone was a benefactor who gave money to the poor and supported charities. To his enemies, he was a ruthless killer despite all his crimes. Capone was devoted to his wife May and son Sonny, love of luxury. He lived in a mansion, drove roads, and threw grand parties. State prosecution. Federal authorities, in particular the IRS, focused on Capone's financial fraud, since it was difficult to prove his involvement in murders and smuggling. In 1931, Capone was convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in prison. He served in Atlanta, but was later transferred to Alcatraz, where his health began to deteriorate sharply due to syphilis. In 1939, Capone was released due to illness. He returned to Florida, where he lived a secluded life. In 1947, Al Capone died of a heart attack caused by syphilis. Capone became an icon of the 1920s. His name is associated with power, facts, and income. The images of Al Capone have inspired dozens of films, books, and television series.